Yes, I went to Southampton first in 1966. I was appointed in 1966. There was absolutely nothing there. No building, no students, no library, nothing. Um, and I had a year from October 66 to October 67 to set up the department. A new building, it was Arts 2, was being built at that stage. We were able to design what space we wanted. We had to appoint staff. We had to advertise for students and appoint students. So that one, and set up courses as well. So that 1 year was the most fantastic time when everything was available and we could design exactly what we wanted. Absolutely blank page. All there was when I went was a shared office, and I shared it with the newly appointed Professor of Theology, I think it was. He was seldom there, fortunately, so it was absolutely blank. No one was telling me what to do or anything. It was quite clear at that stage that there were only going to be 2 or 3 academics, and you couldn't, with that number, teach a full honours course in archaeology. So the first thing we did was to negotiate with the classics department, the history department and the geography department to run joint degrees in archaeology and history, classics and geography. And that was enormous fun because you got to know your colleagues very quickly, and there was a huge amount of sympathy for archaeology then. The classics department had Brian Sparks in it, and Brian was fully understood archaeology and was very sympathetic to it, so it was very easy to develop a rapport there. It was probably the most creative time for archaeology in the country, I think, because remember, this is 1966 to 72, which was when I was there. And archaeology had been very much amateur or academically university based. There was no real practice of archaeology at that stage in terms of formal units, commercial units or anything like that. It was quite clear that archaeology, it was quite clear that rescue archaeology was going to become much, much more important. And we had to, first of all, persuade the government that rescue archaeology was going to cost money and was going to be necessary to do. We had to set up an infrastructure for rescue archaeology, and indeed my inaugural lecture in Southampton was about the need to set up units, archaeological units really. There weren't any archaeological units in those days. And at the same time we realised that if you had commercial units, you needed some form of governance to keep them under control, to maintain standards. And that's when we moved towards setting up what was then called the Institute of Field Archaeology. The biggest challenge, I think, was just keeping up with it all. Everything was happening so fast, and there were so many demands on us. Because the nature of archaeology was changing, and what we were absolutely determined to do was to design an archaeological course that turned out people that were relevant to archaeology in Britain as it was developing. So right at the beginning, I was determined that it was going to be practically based. Archaeology, if you're an archaeologist, you're going to have to get your hands dirty, basically. Yes, I think the thing that really stands out and still sticks in my mind is the camaraderie of the first year of intake, the first students who came in 1967. Yes, 1967. They were fairly carefully chosen out of a lot of applicants. And they felt they were rather special, and they were rather special because we were all in it together and we were all learning together. And many of them have stayed good friends. And they, many of that first year and the second year still meet up regularly socially. And I'm still in contact with a lot of them. So it was that sense of real pioneering, setting up something. And we were all comparatively young then. The lecturers were comparatively young. I can't remember, I was 26, I think. And so not very much older than the students. So it was very easy to work together as a group and to build up this sort of wonderful feeling of here we are, we're developing, we're sort of taking part in the movement forward of archaeology.
My time at Southampton was from 1972 to 1981, and the department was already brilliantly up and running following Barry Cunliffe's tenure as professor, with Arthur Ap Simon and David Peacock really doing good work. So I found it easy to move in and had a very good time. David Hinton joined us and Tim Champion and Sarah, so we were a very strong team. And I particularly remember fieldwork in Orkney at Quantiness with Nick Bradford really running the show, and then later on at Keay with a lot of very bright students at that time: Tim Darville, Mike Parker Pearson, Roger Thomas, also David Richard Hodges, I should say. So it was a good time, and I was rather sorry to leave when I had to go to Cambridge in 1981. So have a very good celebration. I'm sorry I can't be there with you.
Peter Ucko was appointed head of department in 1981, taking up the post at the start of 1982. He'd been director of the Centre of Aboriginal Studies in Australia, and whereas Barry Cunliffe had given the department a reputation for fieldwork, and Colin Renfrew for theoretical approaches, Peter brought a strong anthropological interest with him. The Thatcher years were not an era of university expansion, however, and he was not able to pursue this direction as far as he would have liked. The only new appointment at this time was Simon Keay under what was termed New Blood financing. Peter will be chiefly remembered for the World Archaeological Congress meeting in Southampton in 1984. A conference was originally to be arranged by an established international organisation, but it was discovered that some of those who would attend were from South Africa, then embroiled in apartheid. The Southampton branch of the University Teachers Union called for a boycott, which was supported by the Students' Union. The conference committee, which had asked Peter to organise the event, would not accept this condition, and after a summer of negotiation, it became clear that it could not be held in Southampton. Peter, however, had the bits between his teeth and set up an alternative committee so that a conference could take place in Southampton from which the South Africans were to be banned. And to many people's surprise, this proved very successful, with some 800 people attending. As it was not hemmed in by tradition, it attracted many delegates who wanted new approaches as well as to take a stand against apartheid. It was typical of Peter that he not only extracted the promise of a substantial donation from the newspaper tycoon Robert Maxwell, but achieved the much more difficult task of extracting the actual money. Peter's legacy is that the World Archaeological Congress continues to meet every 4 years and has visited every continent. Peter served as head of archaeology for 6 years. In 1992, he became Dean of the Faculty of Arts, a post which he successfully transformed the faculty from being teaching-led to being research-led. He was able to raise money for new appointments, with archaeology benefiting from appointments such as that of Yvonne Marshall, who brought New World and Canadian experience, as well as being the first female lecturer in the department. It was at this time also that the university committed to moving the faculty to the former Taunton School site, now the Avenue campus. Peter left in 1995 to become director of the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. Sadly, he died not long after his retirement in 2007.
I became head of department in 1989 and until 1992, but I'd been in the university many years before that when I was a member of the classics department. It was quite a it was quite a different experience being in the archaeology department to being in a small classics department, which was very quiet, and this was not quiet at all. people were rushing around and so on, and so it was quite a tough assignment. Perhaps the main thing that happened during that period of 3 years was that David Peacock and I particularly were anxious to establish maritime archaeology as something that was done here. Jon Adams was around, and obviously, he was very interested in there being some lectureship and so on to move into. So I think they were quite willing to see it expand into some other directions, and my goodness, has it expanded the Centre for Maritime Archaeology and so on. So that's very good. That's very good. I put forward 3 of the lecturers, senior lecturers and so on, in the department for personal chairs. And the 3 were Tim Champion, Clive Gamble and Steve Shannon. And they did, in that 1 year, in one meeting of the university, deciding on who should get personal chairs, all 3 of them were given personal chairs. And I think I've said this to other people before, that not really knowing whether this was going to work or not, I started off my recommendation to the committee that all my geese are swans, and they turned out to be swans as well. So that was very good. But it was a time also when the number of students was increasing quite rapidly, and so the expansion of the department was a necessity. So that was very good. Of course, if you're in charge of the department, you're in charge of the money, as it were. One of the technicians came and said, "We've got the departmental cricket team, and we've seen that there's a whole mass of stumps and bats and so on for sale for a really very reasonable price. Do you think the departmental money would stretch to buying it?" And I thought, God, what am I supposed to do? So I thought, oh well, never mind. Yes, they might. So I told them they could buy. I was very popular.
I think I was very lucky because the 1980s had been a very grim time with virtually no money, no expansion. We had virtually no new members of staff. But then things began to change in the early 90s with the finances of the universities were a bit better. We could recruit more students. We had 1 or 2 retirements, so there's a possibility of appointing new people. And I think perhaps the main thing was a change in the policy towards postgraduates, with the expectation that people would have an MA or an MSc before going on to do a PhD. So we had the opportunity to expand the taught postgraduate courses with new developments in areas like maritime archaeology. And so the demography of the department changed, with a lot more master's students, which led on to a lot more doctoral PhD students, but also a lot of new staff. And there were times when we advertised for 3 lecturers in one go, and then sort of got the best set of 3 we could find. And it was an interesting time because we could appoint from a global market, and we got people from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, United States. Even appointed the first women to the department in my time. So yes, major changes at that point. And also undergraduate numbers began to increase as well. So it was a completely different department from what it had been through most of the 1980s. I think probably the most interesting challenge was setting up complete new areas of study and complete new master's programs, because we'd had master's programs and a few master's students, but inventing, for instance, a maritime archaeology program from scratch was quite a challenge, certainly for Jon Adams, who had to do it. what was good about that period then was that we could expand into completely new areas. So we developed an interest in rock art and in maritime archaeology, expanded the interest in computing and osteology, started work on areas like museums and the representation of archaeology, public understanding of archaeology. So that I think changed the character of the department quite a lot to a much wider range of interests, and which made it probably quite distinctive in the range of departments in the UK as well. We could be known for particular specialisms rather than being much the same as everybody else.
Do you know, I've forgotten the exact dates, but it's sometime in the mid-90s. I did 2 stints. I did the mid-90s and then I came back when in fact the position of head of department had been abolished by the Vice-Chancellor of the time, and you were just head of section, and there were no departments. They quickly abandoned that ridiculous idea, but I was head of section, which meant I got all the nasty jobs but no power. So I couldn't go around firing colleagues and doing the sorts of things that heads of department enjoy doing. I just had to go to endless meetings to be told we couldn't do anything, and anyway what we were doing was completely wrong according to the university centre, which wanted to get rid of, I think it wanted to get rid of faculties as well. It created super deans and whatever, but they didn't like us at all as departments. So that was a difficult time. That was in the early 2000s. It was very unstable from the point of view of the university because, you know, it was a bit like finding yourself in the Trump government. The university had no idea what it was doing, but it was led by a kind of ideologue who had been at another university and believed that was the only way you could run things. And he'd arrived in this university and he came down to address the arts faculty and boldly said that he'd never worked in a university with an arts or humanities faculty. So we thought, great, this is going to be exciting. And then he abolished departments and created deans to run everything. And that proved to be a very difficult aspect. And eventually we ended up being run by one of the deputy vice-chancellors because it was too much for the deans. So it was just a mess. It really was a mess. So we had to try and keep ourselves going. But of course, archaeology is always very good at getting headlines and getting grants and doing all the sorts of things which eventually vice-chancellors realise that they need. And vice-chancellors, you know, tend to love their archaeology departments. But this particular vice-chancellor, it took quite a long time to get him on side. But eventually he saw the light and realised that actually what was going on in archaeology was, you know, one of the most exciting areas in the university. And I remember when I was first head of department here, we were in the transition of moving down here, and we had to move out of Arts 2, and of course we had the famous basement stores, and the basement stores had been this place which, you know, you opened the door and just pushed things into it for 30 years. And Nick Bradford, who was our wonderful technician, was in charge of all of this. And it was not in Nick's nature to throw anything away. He had big cardboard boxes full of nuts and bolts, which might just come in useful someday. And of course they did, but it was a nightmare to move. And one thing that we discovered down there was great crates of flint for flint napping. And these were very, very heavy. And the movers didn't want to move them. So I gave the job to David Peacock because nothing was happening and we were up against the deadline of moving. And David, of course, was brilliant. So David rolled up and said to these recalcitrant movers, you know, these are moving. And he said to Nick, you're going to help them. and to some of the other technical staff as well. So he got them all together. And these things, which were in big green crates, suddenly disappeared into the back of the lorry and came down here, and David made a rockery out of them over at the back there, which didn't please all the Paleolithic people, but it was a wonderful resource for then doing flint knapping, and they're still there. I mean, you know, they're working their way through that material, but it was great. But David P was just fantastic at getting that lot moved, and it was a great weight off my mind.
David Peacock led the department twice. He was acting head for a few months in 1981 after Colin Renfrew left and before Peter Ucko arrived, a slightly frustrating period when anything decided was likely to be reversed by the incoming head. He then did a stint from 1998 to 2005. We had by then moved to the Avenue campus, but the new building which now houses us was not even mooted, so it was not a time of major upheaval. We maintained the Grade 5 research assessment exercise rating during his time, which consolidated the reputation of the department for research, and we were also one of the only 2 departments given a perfect score in the teaching quality assessment. The last was not an honour that many of us felt deeply about, as it was largely a matter of knowing how to compose the correct answers to various questions which David considered stultifying. But fortunately he was not asked for his views and played the game during the inspection. He was too conscientious to have done otherwise. In the same way, he attended committee meetings, monitored colleagues, and went through the hoops. But we rarely remember him for the informality and good humour with which he did things, yet to great effect. David was, of course, internationally known for his work on pottery, and later in his career on millstones. He eschewed being typecast as an archaeological scientist, however, undertaking fieldwork in what many of us regarded as arduous circumstances in Tunisia, Egypt and the Sudan, work which he took in his stride as much as he did the rigours of organising the department's annual weekend summer field trip, which morphed into a longer period of field survey on Dartmoor and then Purbeck, which in turn led to departmental excavation in the early 1990s. He had many research students, 1 or 2 memorable for the wrong reasons, but mostly brought up to scratch and still grateful to him. David was awarded the Pomerantz Medal by the American Institute of Archaeology in 2012, a rare honour. He also received the Kenyon Medal from the Society of Antiquaries. He died on March the 15th, 2015.
My name is Professor Matthew Johnson. I worked at Southampton between 2004 and 2011. I was chair of the department between 2005 and 2008. Of course, I still have very close links with Southampton. I'm still a visiting professor there. When I arrived at Southampton from the University of Durham, I arrived as the replacement for the late and much loved Professor David Peacock. At the time I arrived, Simon Keay was head of department, and I succeeded him in the following year. Simon and I continued to work closely together. I remember the department from that time as having a relatively young academic age. It was a place of great promise. People were on the verge of doing great things. There are a lot of junior lecturers, a lot of research students, a lot of early career people. There was also a very strong emphasis on the social and on the relationship between, on the one hand, scientific data, and on the other hand, social theory and lived experience. There was always also a continuing stress on representation and theories of representation, and on the cultural context of archaeological inquiry. The programmes in maritime and human origins were also very strong features at that time. So, given the youth of the department, I saw my role as keeping things on an even keel, mentoring and encouraging the younger scholars to develop, which they have done, and indeed many of them have gone on to do great things. I was helped in this by the other senior scholars, particularly Steph Moser, Yvonne Marshall, David Hinton, and particularly also by my successor as head of archaeology, Jon Adams. We moved into the new building in 2005. We saw some great books published. We saw some key research projects followed through. So I'm very proud of what we achieved together, and I look back on my time as head of department with great fondness.
I was head of department between 2008 and 2012. I took over from Matthew Johnson, and he'd been a very successful head of department, and he laid some really good foundations for me. So in a sense, I had a really smooth takeover. We overlapped, and in fact we had offices right next to each other for the first year or so. And so I was able to nip into Matthew's office saying, you know, what happens now? You know, what do I do? You know, and he was able to steer me straight. And it's quite funny really, because I then found out that everybody who's been head of department always has that first year of, you know, what's happening? How do I do this? You know, because obviously we're not trained for this. But because of Southampton's rather nice habit of stockpiling retired professors, I had also access to lots of other people who had been head of department before me. Simon, he'd been head of department and would be head of department again subsequently. Tim Champion, David Peacock. David Peacock was another one. He'd been head of department twice. And so he was another person I used to go occasionally, knock on his door saying, David, you know, how would you deal with this if you were still head of department? And he'd go, ooh, now let me see. And he'd give me all sorts of tips about how to negotiate my way past various problems. But yeah, it was a great experience. I loved the strategy involved in being the head of a department like this, because it's disparate, multi-talented, going in all sorts of sort of parallel but different directions, each of which is exciting in its own right, but collectively created this great sense of momentum and dynamism. And it was great to be in a situation where I had a sort of overview of that. And that was really, really gratifying. The biggest challenge in a sense, I suppose, is an administrative one, because there's no set procedures, or at least the procedure university life. Set procedures change every year. The pieces of paper change in design every year, and every year you'll find that they have invented new pieces of paper. And so the administrative complexity of all the tasks we do, I think, in my time at the university, thinking back now more than 20 years, which is nowhere near as long as some of my colleagues have been here, but thinking back over that time, things that we used to do with a phone call or an email now have a much more complicated trajectory. My 4 years of head of department crossed that sort of the transition between the old way of doing things and the new way. And that transition was a little bit tricky. We had the economic crash in 2008, and we had an incoming government in 2010, a coalition government, who essentially moved the goalposts for education overnight. They changed the complete funding structure for universities. And so the old mechanism of funding every single student place with a certain amount of money to support the teaching for that student, that went away. And that income, the universities then had to collect through fees. We had to recognise at that time, around about 2010, 2011, that the demographic of archaeology favoured funding for what you could call STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering and maths. So for us, it was computing, it was archaeological science, it was maritime archaeology. Those areas were probably going to be areas in which researchers would have a higher hit rate in getting research grants than in other areas. And so what you do is, without ditching areas that you're doing already, you build up the potential for the others to capitalise on that environment. And I think that's what we did. It changes the way you play the system, to put it bluntly. If there's money out there for archaeological science, you structure your team and your research proposals in order to get that, in order to be able to apply for and win those grants. And going back to that synergy and diversity of our department, that doesn't mean that the research money is only going to go to 2 or 3 people who happen to be in the right subject area. It actually means money flows into the university, stroke faculty, stroke department, and everybody else feeds off that. So the momentum gained by individual grants is strength to the department as a whole. It's the old all for one and one for all principle, if you like.
Well, I'm very fortunate in having been head of department twice. First back in 2005-06 and again in 2012-13. One of the things about being head of department is that you do not have a spare minute. As I was saying to Steph, our current head of department, a few weeks ago, it's a 24/7 job. And you just don't really have time to think very much. You're constantly reacting to situations, you're firefighting or trying to develop problems from happening. It's a very positive experience. I mean, you start out always as an individual. Okay, you work with colleagues. You know, I've worked with classical archaeologists, and you work very much within your niche, either within the department or outside. But when you become head of department, you have to think for the group. And you have to have interests that go way beyond your own. So the Paleolithic right the way through to the post-medieval is just as important as your own. You've got to be completely selfless in that sense. So it helps you develop a more holistic approach to archaeology, even though, as you know, at Southampton we like to say we have a very holistic and interdisciplinary approach anyway. But I think the other thing is that it means that also you've got to try and fight archaeology's corner within the faculty. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, in the sense that we've got a very supportive faculty who helped us in the ways that we help other colleagues too. It's important to be very clear about what archaeology is and what it represents, the kind of synergies that we can develop with other disciplines, not just within the faculty but beyond. So yes, to answer your question, it really does change the way you think about archaeology. When I did come back for the second time, the challenge of what we had to do then was actually quite significant, and it was a challenge to me. You know, we were challenged by falling recruitment figures, and we had to develop a strategy for our teaching to address our low undergraduate student numbers, and also prepare for the forthcoming REF, and actually working together with colleagues to lay the strategy for that, which then Josh followed through when he succeeded me as head of department, was actually really fulfilling, let's put it that way. I felt that I'd made a solid contribution.
Well, I mean, it was an interesting period of time because at that point the department was under review, and it was linked to the fact that we were struggling a little bit, as I think, you know, most UK archaeology departments have been in recent years in terms of undergraduate recruitment. So in a way, much of my time was sort of taken up with the process of ensuring that we developed new programs, that we sort of focused on marketing, we focused on, if you like, trying to increase the appeal of the department in order to increase undergraduate numbers. I think with these sorts of events, it provides quite a focus for everybody. So, you know, for some people it's kind of a wake-up call that perhaps, you know, the world is not quite as secure and stable as they might imagine. But it also brings people together. You know, if you've got a mission, you've got something, you've got a kind of a goal that you've got to hit. It's a great way of actually creating cohesion within a unit, within the department. And I think from that point of view, it was actually quite healthy for the department. You know, it made people think about what it was we could deliver. I suppose it made people sort of think as well about how we want to keep up that sort of energy and momentum that makes the department at Southampton such a great place. I think in a way this is a sort of difference between the way things are now as opposed to the way that they might have been back in the 1970s, back in the 1980s, when you had, you know, individuals who were quite sort of powerful in their own way, because the department was a much more sort of bounded, autonomous unit that had its own budget, had its own capacity to kind of direct and shape itself. And so, you know, you look back at people like sort of Renfrew and Ucko and so forth. I think they had more effective power, and as a result, that kind of role of head of department tended to attract those people who quite liked that sort of gamesmanship, if you like, that sort of power broking.
So universities have changed significantly?
An awful lot, yes. I don't know whether for the better. I mean, some aspects for the better, but they've certainly become more sort of corporatised, more managerial. Everyone's kind of run by sort of audit culture, etc., etc. It's a bit stifling sometimes, and in a way, I think what you've got to do is try and sort of make opportunities for a bit of fun, just to try and sort of break away from that and make sure that people keep being creative and engaged. And fieldwork's perfect in that sense. And we also had an all-staff research symposium as well, which, if you like, was a kind of taken from the Peacock model. And that was great. So we made sure, you know, it wasn't just core academic staff, but all the postdocs were involved as well. So that ran over a couple of days. Everyone gave sort of short presentations on their research, and I think that allowed people to see what everyone else was doing, and it kind of allowed people to sort of see synergies and connections that existed in their work. And I think events like that are really important, events where everyone's kind of brought together and they're allowed to kind of talk about something that really matters to them.
It's very difficult to know where it ought to go, but it would be nice to see it continuing to evolve. The last thing you want to have is a department that's static, and if it was still the same as it is now in another 10 years, then I think we probably have failed. We've got to reflect changes in the academic, the academic study of archaeology, professional demands of archaeology. I think we've done that fairly well, and we've just got to continue to evolve.
I think we perhaps as a department need to kind of at some point sit down and reflect on what the big kind of challenges and the big issues are within the discipline. I mean, it's interesting looking back at things like the legacy of the Ucko years. I mean, not that, you know, he was someone I knew, but you kind of get the sense that there you had an individual who had a sense of how the department should actually sort of play itself out on a kind of world stage, really. And I think it's probably quite important for us to continue to reflect on that and continue to think about how we're playing not just within this institution, but also how we're able to kind of shape the nature of archaeology and contribute to it on a kind of global level.
I think possibly one of the benefits of the way that we are now thinking about our research, I mean, we didn't really understand what impact was all about when it was first built into the research excellence framework. But I think now we do. I think we'd recognise that impact actually is quite a sensible thing to think in terms of the work that you do in a social context. And archaeology has hugely powerful potential in that way. You can virtually every single member of academic staff, you could go through what they're doing that has impact implications, and indeed the research that each of our PhD students is doing. It all has social relevance, which yes, you can look at it in terms of what the thesis would look like as a piece of academic research, but you can also think of it in terms of something that has varying sort of forms of social relevance. I think that's archaeology's strength, which is it is beginning to realise, and I think therein lies the department's future and its strength.
It's always been an exciting ride. It's sometimes has been a little bit dangerous. It's sometimes you do wonder, well, how are we going to get out of this one? But we always have, and we always have because of the quality of the staff, the passion of the students, and it's just worked. When we look at where our students have been and what they've done, several of them have stayed in archaeology, but most have not. But they've gone on to do wonderful things. So it's that kind of entrepreneurial spirit of going out there and punching above the weight, which has been really, I think, the hallmark.